And welcome to this edition of the Native News Update on this Wednesday, August 24th. I'm your host for today's program, Paul DeMain. Many of the stories right here can also be found at our website at IndianCountryNews.com, so go there and see some of these stories. And today we're going to go right into the news. Hundreds of activists have arrived in Washington, D.C. to protest the proposed Keystone XL project, a 1,661-mile pipeline that would carry oil from Canada's tar sands to refineries in Texas, and which is opposed by many Canadian First Nations in that region and tribes in the United States where the pipeline have and will be built. If TransCanada gets the green light from the Obama administration, the pipeline could carry as much as 900,000 barrels of oil every day. The State Department is expected to release a final environmental impact statement on the proposal this month and issue a decision by the end of the year. Since the action began on Saturday, August 20th, 212 people have been arrested outside of the White House. The majority have been processed and released, though some of the higher profile activists were kept from Saturday through this Monday morning, a move many of the protesters believe was meant to deter further protests. The protesters have arrived outside the White House each morning with a group of volunteers agreeing to sit in until they are arrested each day. Organizers estimate that between 50 and 100 people will be arrested every day, with the biggest day of action planned for Saturday, August 27th. And if you want more information on those protests, you can go to motherjones.com. The Red Lake Nation will soon have a new home for the Panema branch of the Red Lake Nation's Boys and Girls Club. The much-anticipated $2.5 million multi-purpose community center is on schedule for fall completion. The groundbreaking for the Boys and Girls Club and new Panema Center was held last May. The new Panema Community Center replaces a nearly 50-year-old facility and trailer for the Boys and Girls Club. In 2009, a facility assessment was completed and determined that the aging facility was in poor condition and could not accommodate the growth needs of the Boys and Girls Club in the community. And today we revisit one of our road trips and give you a bit of some inside information from Prophetstown in Lafayette, Indiana, where during November 7th of this year, they will be noting the 200th year anniversary of the Battle of Tippecanoe. Okay, welcome to IndianCountryTV.com. Today we're in Lafayette, Indiana, where we're going to take a look here at a historic area that actually runs about a mile east and a mile west along the river here. This is Prophetstown. And Prophetstown was established in 1808 by Tecumseh, and he was known as the Prophet. Oh, excuse me, his brother was known as the Prophet, I believe. That was his younger brother. And this was established as the capital of their Pan-Indian movement, a very large coalition and confederacy of tribes from throughout the Midwest. It included people as far north as from Lakota Ojibwe Reservation. And there was people that came up there tried to engage the warriors at Lakota to bring them down. So we know there was outreaches throughout Odawa, Menominee, Sac and Fox, the Miami, and many, many other tribes. And here in Prophetstown is where Tecumseh brought these warriors together. There was over 1,000 of them, according to the sign here. It says that there was a training ground for those 1,000 warriors, and Prophetstown included an area that took care of their families and so forth as they trained. There was the Battle of the Tippecanoe nearby, and we're going to go back to the other side, which is about a half mile away or a little bit more on the other side of the Prophetstown spread that we're going to be taking a peek at. And there was a battle on November 7th, 1811. In which the Confederacy was crushed by the United States government, and Harrison's army burned Prophetstown the next day and destroyed it. It was ran along about 2 miles along the bluff of the river here. It was totally destroyed and actually was the major defeat of Tecumseh's Confederacy at that time. We're going to poke around a little bit in this area here for the next hour or so and bring you some bits and pieces of what Prophetstown might have looked at and some of the other memorial signs in the battleground burial site as well. Coming into the park right away, we were just down here the road a little bit. We're actually on the backside of a reestablished village that shows some of the roadway systems and so forth, and we're going to go visit that in a minute. But shows a picture of both General Harrison, who was the guy that defeated Tecumseh, a picture of Tecumseh, and then his brother, who was known as the Prophet, was actually kind of like a shaman of kinds that helped prophesize and bring this group of people together. Tecumseh himself was a Shawnee, or as we would say, Jawano, or those tribal people to the south. And both him and his brother, of course, were Shawnee natives that brought people together on here. This battle here was just on the other side of the road. We're going to go over there in a minute. It shows what's in the park, what's been burned off between the forest and the prairie and so forth. We're going to go over here. When we opened up with the first battleground site, we were just coming into the park. So we're going to take a look at this general area here in the Prophetstown area and walk through that and look at some of the reenactment of the village that's been built there in a woodland style, and head over down to the battleground area and the battleground memorial site as well later today. Where we're standing right now is on the Prophet's Rock. That was Tecumseh's younger brother, was known as the Prophet, and he's the one who dreamed and basically conjured or whatever, or did the predictions on the battle. Tecumseh's brother, Prophet, and some of his men came back here to keep track of the battle, and we're on Prophet's Rock. We're on a very sharp ridge here that we just came up. You can see down below there may be a marker in the background and traffic here, but across the valley, we're in a very thick foliage and some beautiful, beautiful oak trees here that are 300 and 400 years old, according to the people around the neighborhood here, is where the Prophet stayed while the battle took place across the swamp here. And we were at the Battleground State Park, the location of the actual battle, which was centered off on about an acre of land with the U.S. government troops that was surrounded by the forces here. Tecumseh was out of town, which is part of the reason that General Harrison decided to begin to probe the forces that were staying in Prophetstown, some 1,000 warriors at that time, made up of tribes throughout the Great Lakes area, including Delawares, Miamis. The 1811 battle actually led to the removal of the Potawatomis from Indiana in 1838, but the removal was called the Trail of Death, the Potawatomi Trail of Death, in which they ended up in Kansas. But the elements that went into that removal of the Potawatomis, Miamis, and the Delawares, another one from Indiana, was all set in place in 1811 here across the creek and swamp from the battleground site. Further on is where Prophetstown was located. And so they were gathered there. These people were very adamant against any more U.S. expansion, and actually Tecumseh and his Confederacy decided that they were going to say, this is it, there was not going to be any further incursion west. They gave up the white man's dress, they gave up on his religion, they returned a lot of the elements that they had traded for. There was actually a return to a very conservative provincial belief, and the U.S. government felt threatened by it, because indeed this Confederacy was put together to prevent the expansion of the United States. This is a really interesting spot. It gives me a lot of chills to be up here, because in a way I can see what went into the feeling, the spirituality of this. It's interesting that there's a huge battlefield monument. You can see that they spent a lot of money. They put brass railings around it. There's nice picket railings around the acre and a half where the battlefield took place. There's a huge monument, which you're seeing in this video content. There are headstones scattered throughout the area there, because families were told where their relatives had fallen, and so headstones were put there and scattered throughout the battlefield. We asked about where the Indians were buried. We heard a couple of stories. You can read about stories about how the prophet and his warriors took their dead and buried them in a location that was later desecrated by non-natives who came several years later and dug up all the bones and scattered them, and scattered the bones of horses and everything else. And even a few years later that, people came back and gathered up those scattered bones and reburied them. We asked a couple people here about that, and they couldn't tell us where that burial grounds was. I suspect that if we probed the native community, that they might be able to tell us what they know about that history, because a lot of these burial grounds of native people were cloaked. They didn't want people going there and digging up artifacts and weapons and other things that might have been buried with these warriors, and so a lot of times those sites were cloaked. But right now we've heard several stories, and one of the stories is people really don't know where the Confederacy soldiers that fought against the U.S. government here were buried. Again, they were made up of tribes: Potawatomis, Miamis, Odawas, Ojibwe, Menominees. We know that Tecumseh traveled all over the Great Lakes area and far west. We have stories at the Lakudere Ojibwe Reservation in northern Wisconsin about Tecumseh and his warriors coming up there trying to recruit people to come down here to Prophetstown and get ready to keep the expansion of the U.S. So all in all, we've spent a good morning here traveling in an area of about 6 miles back and across from the Wabash River up to here where Prophetstown Village used to be the proper one. They're building a replica up on the state park now, the battleground field site. This site, which is a little bit more obscure back on the back roads, but is a beautiful, beautiful site. We spent enough time here to get at least a little bit of a story about what's going on here. Tremendous amount of Native American history here, with one small monument down here, a huge monument to the U.S. forces, an unknown burial site for the Native people. I think what Native people are always looking for is that equity in these historic things, and so we hope that maybe we come back someday, there'll be a fuller story, more access to some of these sites, and they're preserved well. Right now we can see that hundreds of people climb over the rocks in the areas here, that there are paths coming up from all over the kinds of places. There's a lot of erosion and deterioration of the site. It's a very beautiful site in here, probably a very spiritual site. I'm sure that the prophet came here because he thought that this is where destiny was controlled through him. They failed in that particular part, but nevertheless, there are things that I can feel here that there's a spirited entity here that remembers that. We just want to remember our fallen warriors and keep their history alive. I'm Paul DeMain for IndianCountryTV.com. We're in Lafayette, or near Lafayette, Indiana, near the battle site of the Battle of Tippecanoe and Tecumseh and his brother, the Prophet, which engaged in that war in the U.S. military. And that is the latest roundup of news from Indian Country on this edition of the Native News Update. Miigwech for joining with us.